Well, welcome to another episode of the Residential Developer Podcast. My name's Nathan Battershall. I'm your host, and I'm really privileged to have Dan Anderson, Bushfire Consultant from Apical Bush Fire Consulting. Good to have you in, mate.
Yeah, hi Nathan. Thanks for having me, mate.
It's good to have you. Great to have you. And obviously, you're a jack of all trades. We've already had you on talking about arboriculture and tree protection. And obviously, due to your background, you're obviously very skilled, and you've got a great team who we're privileged to work with when it comes to bushfire management, bushfire protection. So I wanted to do a session today, and I think it's really important because of obviously a lot of areas on the East Coast and regional New South Wales where there's a lot of bushfire affection, and it's a massive thing when it comes to doing developments, residential developments. I've seen people buy sites that unfortunately can't be developed, or where there's large areas that are heavily impacted that are not developable. Can you tell us a little bit around what got you into bushfire consulting and a little bit around where that's taken you?
Yeah, sure. I've always been interested in vegetation and ecology. So I guess the pathway for me into this space was understanding different types of vegetation. Being an ecologist, I have a really, I guess, in-depth interest in what you call species composition and vegetation complexes, where you're looking at like what different plants grow together in different environments, in different soil types, in different aspects of the landscape. So I guess as a migration from understanding vegetation and getting my head around plants, and also trying to make a living, which is generally based more around the built environment and human activities, I guess I pursued knowledge in a whole range of areas that I'd probably describe as environmental planning. And obviously in the Australian scenario and the type of landscape we live in, fire regime and wildfire or bushfires has been something that the landscape has actually evolved with over many hundreds of thousands of years. So therefore, it's even more entrenched in our landscapes that the plants actually respond to fire, but they also proliferate fire as well in that cycle. So I guess by understanding plants, in some ways you can start to understand how things burn in the landscape from that side of it. It's very technical fire planning and fire behaviour. So that's just one element. But yeah, I guess I started there and went on the journey to become a qualified practitioner in bushfire planning, which is managed under what they call the BPAD scheme. So the BPAD scheme is supported by the New South Wales RFS and also the FPAA, so the Fire Protection Association of Australia. So yeah, it's another space in planning that's really interesting, and obviously from more recent events, the fires more recently in 2019 and 2020 summers on the East Coast, and before that in the Victorian situation, and fires in Canberra, I think back in 2009. Essentially, this is a highly evolving space in planning due to the natural disasters that we've experienced.
Yeah. And look, as we mentioned, there's a lot of areas across New South Wales that are heavily areas that are bushfire prone and affected. And just because a site is bushfire prone and affected doesn't necessarily mean you can't do a development. Can we just jump into first and foremost chatting about the BAL-29? Obviously, we're talking into the space of like duplexes, dual occupancies, townhouse developments. Where did this come about, this BAL-29? And maybe we can go a step back further, and there's probably some maybe starting investors that are going, what do you mean BAL? What's a BAL? Listeners that are new to this bushfire planning, what is a BAL? What's it stand for? What's it mean?
Yep.
And what does 29 mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I guess that's how we do sort of talk, and that's the terminology in fire planning space, is it is encompassed by that BAL statement. And if we just go back to, I guess, the infancy, is having the bushfire prone land maps, which are adopted across the state and modified and updated as a function between the local government and the RFS and other government agencies. So generally every sort of 3 to 5 years, each LGA will update their bushfire-prone land map, which has 3 categories of vegetation type. So we have category 1, 2, and 3. Category 3 is a newer vegetation type. So it's mapped as orange on the state mapping. Category 1 is mapped as red, which is sort of what you would expect as a national park or a heavily wooded forested area or a woodland area. That's category 1. Category 2 is an area that's called a buffer, which is 100 meters from an area 1 or a category 1. So 100 meters from any of those sort of vegetated sources is called a buffer area to that fuel source. And then category 3 is a newer classification, which is essentially encompasses all other vegetation that's hard to map into. It's not forest or woodland, but it could be a plantation, it could be pastoral grasses or an agricultural rural environment that obviously has a fuel load that doesn't reflect a forest or a woodland area. So once that's established, you're then working within this construction scheme, which fits under the National Construction Code. That's the planning instrument that looks at a building's capacity to respond to a fire event or to be defensible from a fire event. And that's where we're starting to talk in more engineering terms around products, building materials, and testing, the testing of things, of products that we use to build with. So a BAL rating essentially relates to a bushfire attack level, which is written in the Australian standards and the National Construction Code as a surrogate or as a measure for a building's capacity to withstand heat. And it's a measure that's derived in kilowatts per square meter.
Yep.
So it's actually the ability of a fire or a heat source to radiate kilowatts per square meter to a recipient material. So say a wall of a building, the outside elevation of a building will be exposed to this radiant heat, and that's measured in the BAL rating from a BAL-Low, which is anything under 10 kilowatts, then a BAL-12.5, which is 12.5 kilowatts of radiant heat per square meter, to a BAL-19, to a BAL-29, to a BAL-40, and to a BAL-Flame Zone, or Flame Zone, where essentially the expectation is that the flames from the fire can actually connect directly to the building.
Yes.
So, yeah, those ratings are then transformed into a building's material or a construction system that is designed to actually resist that level of heat.
Yep.
So that's where it gets fairly complex, and things are tested in laboratories and so on. Where that's really enshrined in our current planning system is that a BAL-29 is deemed as, I guess, a risk that's somewhat acceptable for a reasonable level of development density in a location. So anything beyond that, so let's call that a moderate to high exposure risk in the landscape. Anything above that, so when we go to BAL-40 and BAL-Flame Zone, we're looking at, in a general sense, distances around sort of 20 to 25 meters from a source.
Yep.
So if you back onto a reserve, for example, and your lot's 25 meters long and the reserve behind you is unmanaged, you're going to have a BAL-40 or BAL-Flame Zone outcome.
Yep.
So the RFS have devised a guideline, a policy which links into the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. It's called Planning for Bushfire Protection. It goes through a whole range of metrics and measures that are tested against to show cause that a development type can comply or can suitably align itself with these acceptable solutions to a fire event.
Yep.
And a big part of that in planning is construction. So the building's capacity to absorb or to support the inhabitants within it that's the scale of risk.
Yep.
So a bushfire planner's role is to identify the risk using, again, proven methodology that's accepted in the guidelines and the standards, and then coordinate that into a BAL rating for each elevation of the building based on the situational awareness in the landscape.
Yep. No, that's great. And look, in terms of the BAL-29, obviously a lot of people don't realise this, but a granny flat or what we traditionally call a secondary dwelling also falls under that category, doesn't it, as well?
That's right.
BAL-29.
Yeah. So I guess the planning instruments, and in this case rolls up into legislation, is based around that. If you're increasing population density, or you're increasing the amount of inhabitants to an existing site, we need to show that we're achieved by doing that. We need to show that we're either achieving an improved bushfire management outcome in general, or that we're not exceeding a risk threshold of 29 kilowatts per square metre, BAL-29 scenario.
Yeah.
Again, based on the facts that if we're putting more people in a high-risk area, that's not great decision-making, and that's going to put pressure on things like other protection measures like roads, water supplies, emergency service response to a location. So whilst it is site-specific bushfire planning and bushfire risk, areas are fairly obviously affected by bushfires based on their history, based on their topography, and based on their general layout. So again, we're looking at sites that are fairly incised topography with gullies, ridge tops, steep land, areas where the population has tended to live in trees.
Yep.
So in the Sydney example, we're talking pretty much, the northern side and the southern extent, so the Hornsby Shire and the Sutherland Shire.
Yep.
Anywhere along the main river thoroughfares, even on the northern sort of side, through Lane Cove and those kind of areas, we tend to get these kind of fire corridors occurring in the landscape along river basins and green corridors.
Yeah.
And generally those areas have high land slope topographies or exceeding variances of slope.
Yep.
Which is also a big factor in fire behaviour. So fire speed, the angle of flames, and they're all factors that are entrenched in modelling for risk. Yeah.
You could get let's just say someone's got a site they want to do some townhouses on. Is it true that you can get a site that might have a back part of the site might be BAL-40, or let's say flame zone even, then it might be a little section of the site might be BAL-40, then a whole bunch of the site might be BAL-29, then a whole section of the front might be BAL-19, for example. Does that mean that you could build a development within that BAL-29 or less on that site?
If it's considered a subdivision, and the term subdivision does relate to increasing occupancy on that site from a single dwelling beyond, building cannot occur at a scale of risk beyond BAL-29. Yeah. So BAL-29 will occur on a site based on the distance from the recipient fuel source.
Yes.
And as that distance increases, we're more likely to get closer to or under that level of risk. So yes, that essentially if it's multi-dwelling or if it's subdivision, then BAL-29 is the alignment where we can't exceed building into that space.
Yeah. Yep.
So we can go from 29 and then migrate to 19 and 12 and a half over a lineal space on a lot.
Yep.
But the setback to BAL-29 is going to be non-developable space.
Yes. Yeah. And I think a prime example of that, and a reason I bring that up is because I sometimes hear people who are looking to buy a site, especially in a new subdivision area where they actually show you what the BALs are. And like you helped us with my site, one of my site development sites, for example, where it was a 60-metre long site. Initially, we were told that there was a 20-metre APZ, asset protection, the APZ at the back. You did your reports, and we were able to deem and prove to council and show council that was actually incorrect. It was wrongly classified. I think we got it down to 11. So it essentially meant the back 11 metres, we couldn't do anything on it. But it gave us essentially just over 50 metres, for example, of developable space to be able to do, in that instance, 4 townhouses. What can you just explain again? Probably to a listener who's never heard this term, but that as they're getting into development, they're going to see it. What is the term APZ?
So that's asset protection zone, and APZ is a form of managed land that is I guess it's an agreement, or it's something that's an APZ is going to have to be verified legally either by an instrument, say an easement instrument, or a management agreement where an authority, a landholder, has agreed in writing to manage an area to benefit development in an associated location.
Yes.
So again, like if the property's backing onto an easement corridor, say a transport network corridor, or it's backing onto some land that's managed by Sydney Water, it's got water tanks and water infrastructure, or even a council reserve. Unless that authority has lodged an easement for asset protection zone on the edges of their property, the hazard or the risk from their property that's imposed on, say, your property is going to be at that boundary line.
Yeah.
Unless an agreement has been made or can be proven that the land owner is going to manage that site in perpetuity, so for the life of the development.
Yeah.
Which is fairly problematic because obviously public authorities, land managers don't have a lot of funding to manage large tracts of land. Crown land's a big example, national parks is another. but it doesn't necessarily have to be as obvious as a national park. Like, you know, if you're buying next to an airport, it's fairly obvious. But fire hazards can kind of appear in different forms. And generally, if you've got an area of land that's more than 50 metres wide in a gully, that's creating a hazard. Yeah. So councils can't manage all APZs. It's financially impossible. Yeah. So it's definitely a big ticket item in terms of understanding the risk metric of a site. And when you're going into higher density, you're not afforded the ability to improve the construction rating of the building. Yeah. So if it's a single dwelling, we can engineer our way out of some of these scenarios by spending money on good products and having a house that will withstand a high level of exposure. Yep. But when we're going into higher density, the understanding is, well, why are we putting more people in an area that has an agreed hazard to a level that we think is reasonable or beyond, and then hoping to manage that level of increased population? It's not a decision that anyone can make. Yeah. There's way too many issues and liabilities with that kind of process. So definitely. Yeah, and the RFS and the FPAA and I guess all the other academic people and who are experienced and experts in this field, they've put together this guide, this planning for bushfire protection, which is kind of tries to consider all the functions of land use and development in the state and try to balance out what's reasonable, what would be seen as unreasonable, and what expectations and solutions are required by a proponent, a developer, to show that a development is of a sound idea and will not worsen the condition of bushfire risk or impede any future inhabitant of that site of safe access and egress from the area. And outside of the site itself, there are other functions of access that do impose on developments, where particularly rural res kind of landscapes, peri-urban landscapes, where we have to actually improve internal road widths and perimeter roads and turning bays. So there is a loss of kind of developable space, which is a surrogate of bushfire planning as well. Yeah, that's not directly aligned with a BAL rating.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think even, again, like we spoke about recently on your episode around arboriculture, like I think engaging and getting some due diligence before the acquisition of the site is very vital in determining, can you do a dual lock or multi-dwelling on this site? And just because you can, like, you might end up having such a small developable area. And I know you've done this for us before, where we've looked at a site. We might need like a 30-metre setback off the rear boundary. So all of a sudden, once you factor in your front building setback, a 30-metre setback at the rear, all of a sudden you got 6 metres, 8 metres, 5 metres. All of a sudden, it's just not achievable. Yeah. So it means, okay, well, that site, it's really only suited to one dwelling. So you can't do 2 on it, or you can't do 3. Are there any tools? Obviously, I always advocate for people to engage a bushfire consultant before acquiring a site, but I guess the challenge can be where you've got someone might be looking at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sites to determine what they want to do. You don't want them ringing you 24/7. Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Yeah. Are there some tools for people that are looking for sites that they can develop? Are there some tools to help them sort of identify if what's likely to be sort of BAL 29 or less? Is there any tools out there that people can use?
Yeah, great question. And the RFS have developed a fairly good library of tools and I guess education-based documents, and even some interactive things on the RFS website. So there's a bushfire prone land lookup tool where you can just put in a lot in DP or an address, and it will give you that sort of arbitrary, yes, you are in a bushfire prone land zone.
Yes.
Or no, you're not. All councils will have the bushfire prone land mapping on their LEP maps.
Yep.
They are reasonably updated and relevant, but one thing around that, actually, the relevancy of, the landscapes can change fairly quickly in certain areas, particularly in growth corridors and so on. So a lot of the time, a bushfire consultant's role is to actually go out into the landscape and get empirical site-based information.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff is relied upon at the desktop level. So you're looking at sort of modelled and sort of measured tools like GIS and near mapping and plant community type data sources that anyone can sort of access through some of these web portals, but they're not always at the most accurate level based on what's occurring around that location, which can make some fairly significant differences on sites where there's different phases in a subdivision, for example. The tools that you can access online, there's some good government data sets available. So one is the New South Wales seed mapping we use a lot, which is it's an environmental mapping portal where it has a lot of the data layers available in one place, so you can turn different layers on and off. So that's one portal that we use a lot. There's the RFS bushfire prone land tool on the website. We can see whether the site's affected by fire, and a general understanding of slope and where hazards have been designated hazards in the landscape is really key. It gets quite technical from that point forward in terms of a particular site, but it's a good place to start. That if you're in a bush area, like for example, 70% of the Shoalhaven LGA is considered bushfire prone land. So. Yes. And that would be the case for a lot of mid-North Coast, North Coast sort of regional council areas.
Yep.
So you have to be mindful of that fire hazards can also encroach in on the boundaries of urban areas, even where grassland exists, because grassland burns. It burns in a different way in terms of its behaviour, but it can still ignite a property. So, yeah, there is a lot of data available, and there is more than there used to be, and fire science has developed a long way off the back of recent events, which is kind of a sad indictment of what's happened to people. But again, like the more recent fires that we had, almost on a continental scale on the East Coast, it affected 4,000 or 5,000 homes.
Yeah, still recovering.
Yeah, exactly, and like loss of life, loss of property that was underinsured, whole areas that have to question and quantify whether it's a good idea to rebuild in those locations. So it's definitely a big item of consideration, and it's something that can be somewhat inflexible as well, because you can't change the broader risk in the landscape, and you can only defend a building or a structure's ability to resist fire. So we in some ways we have a lack of control over what we can plan ourselves out of. And when you're doing a single dwelling, you also have access to a broader range of options with your product opportunities, and you can build a house to BAL-FZ, and you can live in a high-risk landscape should you choose to do so. But as a developer, you can't be seen to increasing a density or putting more people in a high-risk area.
Yeah.
Because it's just not a metric that we've chosen to design out of, which makes
which is good, I think.
Complete sense. Yeah, of course.
No, it's good. That's good. Yeah, well, look, I think it's the reality is, yes, there are opportunities to develop in areas just because it's bushfire. Sometimes people think just because it's bushfire prone, you can't develop it in that area. Obviously, you've just got to make sure it's that lower rating. So in terms of people getting in touch, I guess the beauty is people can pay to get some due diligence early in the piece before they buy a site, can't they? Really, to determine, can you achieve a lower rating on that site, just so they've got the confidence to be able to go and acquire that site.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is becoming fairly common that like bushfire planning practitioners will be used for that feasibility type role in terms of going out there and actually ground truthing the situation for a particular site. Because there are other factors like location in proximity to other developments. There are provisions for shielding that can be utilised where other properties are actually between a fuel source and a recipient site. So there's a function there that those properties have a role in shielding a property.
Yep.
And like I said, there's a lot of changes that occur in the landscape due to other development, different stages of development. And we do a lot of work where we're in greenfield sites where there isn't a lot of vegetation, but until the next phase or a property next door, which is obviously subject to being developed, but until it is developed, it's still creating a hazard for a period of time.
Yes. And
where that is occurring, you have to manage that hazard for the life of your development. So the hazard might be removed in 2 years, but you've had to build to a standard that's going to be retained for 30.
Yeah.
And in terms of cost, if we're looking at like a 4-bedroom dwelling, like a standard kind of build, a BAL-29 may raise $25,000 to $35,000 of increased cost. Mind you, you're getting better products.
Yeah.
So you're going to get a house that performs better, and that's from an efficiency perspective, because I guess a surrogate for good fire management, you're using similar strategies and techniques to get good efficiencies.
Yes.
Thermal efficiencies. But if you then scale that up to like a BAL-Flame Zone and a 40 being somewhat in between but probably more geared towards a Flame Zone price, $25,000 increase at 29 at Flame Zone could actually equal $250,000 on a build that's, say, 400.
Yep.
So
it's a big jump.
It's a big jump. And that imposes other risks for the life of that dwelling as well, like insurance, and also what you're actually functionally capable of doing with that design.
Yep.
You can't have raised decks and all your glazings covered in shutters for periods where you've got high fire risk and so on. So it has a whole range of factors and influences. But in terms of density, we're governed by that BAL-29 metric, which, like you said, is thrown up quite a bit.
Yes.
But it's a little bit complex to get to understanding how that BAL-29 occurs. And it is a function of distance from the hazard, the slope of the land, the type of vegetation, so how it burns, how much fuel it's got, and whether there are other elements in the landscape that are providing a shield or a management benefit that aren't picked up on the maps, because the maps are done at a really large scale.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, maybe at some stage we might get you on for next year. Maybe we might even run a few little scenarios around how to achieve that BAL-29 on a particular slope, particular vegetation, and we can just so people can understand. But I think first and foremost, the main thing I wanted to get home was the importance of a good qualified bushfire consultant when you're looking at a site, when you're dealing with a site, before you buy it, but definitely before you start designing too, to avoid headaches down the track. So
yep.
Thanks
Indeed.
for coming on again, mate. It's been really invaluable, and I'm sure a lot of people have got a lot out of it. And look, if you enjoyed this episode, I want to encourage you to share it, like it, subscribe it, share it with other people doing projects. We're going to make sure that Apical's details are in the show notes. They're invaluable when it comes to bushfire consulting, both at a due diligence phase early in the process, but also getting the reports, whether it be for a DA or a CDC. So, thanks for coming on again, mate. And
thank you, mate.
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you
the
for
time.
all listening, and we'll see you again next week.